When Donald King unexpectedly crosses paths with Catherine Tim at daycare, his life takes a turn he never saw coming. Donald King's morning was already off to a rough start. His phone jolted him awake at 7:30 a.m., his assistant reminding him about an important board meeting. Between reviewing last-minute reports and answering urgent emails, he barely had time to think, let alone get his 3-year-old daughter, Tracy, ready for daycare. Now, maneuvering through New York's heavy traffic in his sleek black Audi, Donald glanced at Tracy in the rearview mirror. She softly hummed a tune, hugging her stuffed rabbit clothes. "We're here, sweetheart," he said, pulling up in front of the daycare. Tracy looked at the unfamiliar building, her big brown eyes filled with uncertainty. "But Daddy, this isn't my school." Donald, already preoccupied with his upcoming conference call in 10 minutes, barely processed her concern. He unbuckled her seatbelt and crouched to her level, gently tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "I know, baby. We're trying a new place today. You're going to have so much fun," he reassured her. Tracy hesitated, eyeing the bright and colorful little Pepsi daycare sign. This wasn't where she usually went. "What if I don't like it?" she asked in a small voice. Donald kissed her forehead and smiled. "You'll be fine, I promise." Without a second thought, he handed her over to a staff member and hurried back to his car, completely unaware of the major mistake he had just made. Catherine Tim had always believed children had an instinct for sensing when something was off. When Tracy King stepped into Little Wonder's daycare, clinging to her stuffed rabbit like it was her only comfort, Catherine knew something wasn't right. The first red flag? Tracy wasn't on the student list. The second? The man who dropped her off had rushed out so quickly he hadn't checked a single detail. Frowning, Catherine knelt to the little girl's level. "Hey there, sweetheart. What's your name?" Tracy hesitated before whispering, "Tracy King." Catherine's heart clenched at the nervousness in the little girl's voice. "Well, Tracy, it looks like we weren't expecting you today. Do you know your teacher's name?" Tracy shook her head, holding her rabbit tighter. Catherine sighed and pulled out the emergency contact list, dialing the guardian number. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. This was exactly why she disliked dealing with high-profile parents. They always assumed someone else would handle everything for them. Softening her tone, she said, "How about this? You stay with me today and we'll figure things out when your daddy comes back, okay?" Tracy hesitated, then nodded slowly. And so, Catherine spent the entire day with Tracy, helping her with arts and crafts, reading stories, and sitting with her during lunch when she refused to eat alone. By the afternoon, Tracy had opened up, laughing and playing with the other kids. But Catherine wasn't looking forward to the confrontation with the man who had abandoned his daughter without a second thought. Donald strode into Little Pepsi daycare with a mix of urgency and guilt. His last meeting had barely ended when he noticed a voicemail from an unknown number. "Mr. King, this is Catherine Tim from Little Pepsi daycare. Your daughter was dropped off at our facility by mistake this morning. I've been trying to reach you all day. Please call me back immediately." His stomach dropped. How had this happened? His assistant had confirmed Tracy's daycare drop-off the night before. As he stepped inside, his sharp gaze swept across the room, until it landed on a woman standing next to Tracy. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was a mix of unimpressed and challenging. Donald immediately recognized the frustration in her eyes. She wasn't happy with him. Neither was Tracy. His daughter pouted the moment she saw him. "Daddy, you put me in the wrong school." Exhaling, Donald knelt beside her. "I know, sweetheart. That was Daddy's mistake. I'm sorry." Tracy huffed, crossing her tiny arms. "I like it here." Before Donald could respond, the woman, Catherine, cleared her throat. "You must be Donald King," she said, her voice even but edged with disapproval. The man who didn't bother answering his phone all day. His head snapped up, brows furrowing. "I had back-to-back meetings." Catherine didn't flinch. "And I had a scared little girl who didn't know why she was here. Tell me, Mr. King, what exactly was so important that you couldn't check your phone when your daughter needed you?" An unfamiliar pang of guilt settled in Donald's chest. "I appreciate you taking care of her," he said, keeping his voice controlled. "But this was an accident. It won't happen again." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "No, it won't. Because next time I won't just call. I'll report it to Child Services." Donald clenched his jaw. No one talked to him like that. But before he could fire back, Tracy reached for Catherine's hand, looking up at her with complete trust. And that's when something shifted inside Donald. Tracy was comfortable with this woman. More than that, she liked her. For the first time in years, Donald King found himself at a complete loss for words. And Catherine Tim? She had just become the one woman he wouldn't be able to ignore. The moment Donald carried Tracy out of Little Wonder's daycare, his daughter made her feelings very clear. "Daddy, I want to come back here tomorrow," she declared. Tracy's small hands clung to Donald's suit sleeve as he secured her in the car seat. He frowned, realizing the mistake. "Tracy, this isn't your daycare. Your school is across town." "But I like it here," she pouted. "Miss Catherine is nice." Donald sighed, already feeling a headache coming on. "I'm sure she is, but you have friends at your real daycare." Tracy shook her head, her curls bouncing. "Miss Catherine played with me and read my favorite book, twice." Donald resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He still wasn't sure what to make of Catherine Tim. Yes, she had taken care of Tracy in his absence, but she had also confronted him in a way no one else ever had. Yet, something about the way Tracy clung to the idea of returning gave him pause. That night, as he tucked Tracy into bed, she gazed up at him with those big brown eyes, the ones that always made him weak. "Please, Daddy," she whispered. "Just one more day?" Donald ran a hand through his hair and sighed. Just one more day. What was the worst that could happen? The next morning, Donald found himself back at Little Wonder's daycare, leading an excited Tracy through the doors. Catherine looked up from where she knelt beside a group of toddlers, surprise flickering in her expression. "Back so soon?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Donald straightened his tie. Tracy insisted. Catherine smirked. "Smart girl." He opened his mouth to respond, maybe with a sarcastic remark, but Tracy had already run off to play, leaving them alone. Silence stretched between them before Donald finally spoke, his voice measured. "I'm letting her stay for a few days." Catherine crossed her arms. "And you trust me with that?" Donald's jaw tightened. Did he? "I trust my daughter," he said simply. "And she seems to trust you." Something unreadable passed through Catherine's expression. "Fair enough." For the next few days Donald kept his distance. He arrived on time every morning, dressed in sharp suits, offering only a polite nod to Catherine before leaving. But he watched, always watched, and what he saw began to shift his perception of her. One afternoon, Donald arrived earlier than usual to pick up his daughter, Tracy. As he stepped inside, he found Catherine sitting in a reading circle with the children, her voice warm and engaging as she read Goodnight Moon. Tracy was curled up beside her, completely absorbed in the story. But it wasn't just the book, it was the way Catherine spoke, how she made each child feel special, as if they were the only one in the room. Donald stood frozen near the doorway, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. When the story ended, Tracy spotted him and lit up. "Daddy," she called, running into his arms. Catherine looked up too, and for the first time since they had met, there was no defiance in her gaze, only understanding. That realization shook Donald more than he cared to admit. He told himself that arriving early was a coincidence, just a gap in his schedule. But as the days passed, he knew better. It wasn't about time. It was about her. One afternoon, he arrived to find Catherine reading Where the Wild Things Are to a group of children. The kids were completely mesmerized, their eyes filled with wonder. And there, nestled against Catherine's side, was Tracy, her tiny hands gripping Catherine's sweater like she belonged there. Donald should have stepped in, announced his presence. But he didn't. Instead he watched. He watched as Catherine gently brushed a stray curl from Tracy's face. He watched as Tracy leaned into her, safe and content. A warmth spread through his chest, something dangerous, something he wasn't ready to name. For years, Donald had kept his world orderly, free of distractions. No room for emotions. But something was shifting and he wasn't sure if he could stop it. A week later it happened again. He arrived to find Tracy fast asleep in Catherine's lap, her small body curled against her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Catherine absent-mindedly stroked Tracy's hair, whispering a lullaby. Donald didn't move. For 4 years he had raised Tracy alone, ensuring she had everything she needed, except this. The warmth of a mother's embrace. The security of being held. His throat tightened. He had convinced himself Tracy was fine without it. But seeing her so peaceful in Catherine's arms, he knew he had been lying to himself. And for the first time in years, Donald felt something he never let himself feel. Longing. Donald prided himself on keeping personal matters separate from his life. But Catherine lingered in his thoughts, the way she cared for Tracy, the quiet strength in her eyes. That evening, after putting Tracy to bed, he did something he never allowed himself to do. He looked Catherine up. It didn't take long to find an old news article. Tragic car accident claims lives of Tim family, only daughter survives. Donald stared at the screen, his pulse steady but his mind spinning. Catherine had lost her entire family in one terrible moment. Yet, instead of letting it break her, she had dedicated her life to caring for children, giving them the love she had lost. Something twisted inside him. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the weight of her past or the realization that he cared. Donald had spent years locking his emotions away, keeping his world controlled. Love, real all-consuming love, was a weakness. And Catherine? She was the biggest threat to that belief. So he did what he knew best. He pulled away. Catherine noticed immediately. The shift in his demeanor. The way his eyes no longer lingered. The sharpness in his voice. At first she thought she was imagining it. But as the days passed she knew Donald King was distancing himself. And the worst part? She had no idea why. Then one rainy afternoon fate stepped in. Donald's car broke down right outside the daycare. Inside, Catherine was finishing up when she spotted him in the downpour, frustration clear on his face as he checked the engine. Without hesitation she grabbed an umbrella and stepped outside. "You'll catch pneumonia if you keep standing there," she called. Donald looked up, rain dripping from his hair, his expensive suit soaked. "Car trouble?" she asked, tilting her head. He exhaled. "Apparently." She hesitated, then offered, "Come inside, at least until the tow truck gets here." He looked like he wanted to refuse, but after glancing at the stormy sky, he sighed and followed her in. The daycare was quiet, the children long gone. Catherine handed him a towel and a steaming cup of tea. "I don't drink tea," Donald muttered. Catherine smirked, sitting across from him. "You do now." For the first time in weeks they sat together, no walls, no tension. And for the first time, Donald found himself not wanting to leave. Donald had always prided himself on control, over his business, his time, his emotions. But ever since that stormy evening, Catherine had thrown his carefully built world into chaos. He thought about her at odd moments. Wondered how her day was going. Wondered what she looked like when she wasn't surrounded by children but just being herself. And that terrified him. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He had structured his life to be free of attachments. Tracy was the only exception. So he did what he always did when something threatened his carefully built walls. He pulled away. His greetings became shorter. His eye contact fleeting. If he had once lingered a little too long watching Tracy play, now he was in and out in under a minute. And the worst part? He could see how much it hurt Catherine. Catherine wasn't naive. She noticed the shift right away. The warmth between them was gone. The quiet smiles had disappeared. But she didn't confront him. Because she knew. Donald wasn't running from her. He was running from himself. Catherine had already lost so much in her life. She wasn't the kind of person who chased after someone who didn't want to stay. So when Donald started keeping his distance, she didn't fight it. She let him go. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Because somewhere along the way, without meaning to, without realizing it, she had fallen for him. For the way he looked at Tracy as if she was his whole world. For the way his voice softened when he had said "thank you" that night, as if kindness was something rare but deeply valued. For the man who hid his heart behind walls of steel, but for a brief moment had let her see inside. And now he was shutting her out. So Catherine made her choice. She pulled away too. She stopped staying late when she knew he might arrive. She avoided his gaze whenever he did come. If he wanted distance, she would give it to him. But someone else noticed the change. Tracy. The little girl was sharp, more perceptive than most adults gave her credit for. "Miss Catherine?" Tracy asked one afternoon, clutching the hem of Catherine's sweater. "Why doesn't Daddy smile at you anymore?" The question hit Catherine harder than she expected. She forced a smile, kneeling to meet Tracy's innocent gaze. "Oh, sweetheart, your daddy's just very busy." Tracy pouted. "But he used to laugh when he saw you. And now he just looks sad." Catherine's heart clenched. Because deep down she knew Tracy was right. And maybe, just maybe, Donald wasn't the only one running. Catherine wanted to tell Tracy the truth, that sometimes adults complicated things unnecessarily, letting fear stand in the way of happiness. But Tracy was just a child, too young to understand the weight of such emotions. And Catherine? She was simply a woman who had fallen for a man who wasn't ready to love her back. That night, as Donald sat beside Tracy's bed, tucking her in, he felt more lost than ever. His daughter clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, her sleepy eyes blinking up at him. "Daddy?" she murmured. "Yes, sweetheart." She hesitated before asking, "Do you love Miss Catherine?" The question hit Donald like a tidal wave, leaving him momentarily breathless. His entire body tensed as though she had just uncovered a truth he wasn't ready to confront. Why do you ask that? He replied carefully. Tracy pouted. Because you used to smile when you saw her. Now you don't. And she looks sad too. Donald let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. His 4-year-old daughter had always seen straight through him, even when he refused to see himself. And the truth was undeniable. He did love Catherine. He loved the way she cared for Tracy. He loved the way she challenged him. He loved the way her laughter made the world feel lighter. But more than anything, he loved who he became when he was with her. And he had been a fool for pushing her away. Leaning down, he pressed a soft kiss to Tracy's forehead. Thank you, baby girl. For what? She yawned. For reminding me what matters. A second chance. The next morning, Donald made a decision. Instead of heading to the office, he drove straight to Little Wonder's daycare. When he stepped inside, the room fell silent. Children paused their games, their curious eyes turning toward him. And then he saw her. Catherine stood near a group of kids, reading a picture book aloud. The moment she looked up and saw him, her expression became guarded, her walls instantly rising. Donald, she said carefully, closing the book. What are you doing here? Every instinct told him to handle this carefully, that this wasn't the time or place. But he had already wasted too much time. I need to talk to you, he said. In private, she added, moving toward the hallway. But Donald didn't let her walk away. His voice was steady, yet filled with emotion. No. I need to say this here. Gasps echoed through the daycare. Staff and children turned to watch, but Donald didn't care. Taking a step closer, he met Catherine's eyes. I was afraid, he admitted, his voice raw. Afraid of what it meant to care about you. Afraid of what would happen if I let you in. Catherine's breath caught, but she didn't speak. Donald swallowed hard. You were right. I was running, convincing myself that keeping my distance was the safest choice. He held her gaze, unwavering. But then I realized something. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What? I'm more afraid of living without you. Silence filled the room. Catherine's lips parted, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. But Donald meant every word. I love you, Catherine, he said, finally embracing the truth. And I don't want to run any more. A single tear slid down her cheek. And then, finally, she smiled. For the first time in weeks, she let herself feel everything. The fear, the longing, the love. She looked at Donald, standing there so open, so vulnerable. This wasn't just a man letting down his walls. This was the man she had been waiting for all along. With a shaky breath, she whispered, You idiot. Donald blinked. What? She let out a soft laugh, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. You love me, she murmured against his chest. He held her tightly, relief washing over him. Yeah, he breathed. I really do. For the first time, Donald King knew exactly where he belonged, right there in Catherine's arms. The next chapter. The golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the daycare windows, filling the space with warmth. Catherine stood in the playroom watching toddlers build a castle out of wooden blocks. This place had been her passion, her life's work. And now it felt like home in more ways than one. Miss Catherine. Daddy's here. Tracy's excited voice rang through the room. Catherine turned just as Donald stepped inside. Dressed in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, he looked as confident as ever. But his eyes held something softer now, something only she got to see. Tracy grabbed Catherine's hand, tugging eagerly. Come on. Daddy has a surprise. Catherine chuckled, letting the little girl pull her forward. A surprise? Donald smirked, hands in his pockets. Tracy, sweetheart, do you think you can give me a moment alone with Miss Catherine? Giggling, Tracy nodded. Okay. But don't take too long, I want to see the surprise too. She ran off to rejoin her friends, leaving Catherine and Donald standing amidst colorful walls and tiny chairs. Catherine crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. All right, King. What's going on? Donald took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee. The daycare fell silent. Tiny voices whispered excitedly as little eyes watched. And Catherine? Her heart stopped. Donald pulled out a small velvet box and flipped it open, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. Catherine Tim, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. A year ago, I walked into this daycare thinking I was just dropping my daughter off at the wrong place. But I found the right place. The right person. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. You changed everything, Donald continued. You showed me what it means to love, to trust, to build something real. And I don't want to spend another day without you. He exhaled, looking up at her with pure, unguarded love. So, Catherine, will you marry me? A collective gasp rippled through the daycare. Children, teachers, even Tracy, all held their breath, waiting. Catherine let out a shaky laugh, covering her mouth with one hand before nodding furiously. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, Donald. 1,000 times yes." Cheers erupted as Donald slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. Tracy practically tackled them in a hug. "We're going to be a family." Donald kissed the top of his daughter's head, his gaze locking onto Catherine's. "We already are." And for the first time Donald King knew he had everything. A year later, waves crashed gently against the shore as Catherine leaned into Donald's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. Their wedding had been a beautiful, intimate ceremony by the ocean, surrounded by the people they loved most. Now they sat on the back porch of their beach house, watching Tracy chase seagulls along the sand. Catherine placed a hand on her growing belly. Donald noticed instantly, turning to her with a soft smile. "He's kicking," Catherine whispered. Donald placed his hand over hers, feeling the tiny movement. His throat tightened with emotion. "A son?" he murmured. "We're having a son." Catherine smiled. "A little brother for Tracy. A perfect addition to our family." Donald kissed her temple, pulling her closer. He had spent years believing love was a weakness, that opening his heart would only lead to pain. But now, with Catherine in his arms, their daughter laughing in the distance, and their unborn child moving beneath his palm, he knew he had never been more wrong. Because this was everything. Donald King once thought he had it all: wealth, power, success. But it took one wrong daycare, one extraordinary woman, and one loving daughter to show him what truly mattered. Catherine Tim never imagined that a simple mistake would lead her to the love of her life. But love has a way of finding us when we least expect it, in the laughter of a child, in the warmth of an unexpected embrace, and in the quiet moments where hearts learn to trust again. Together, Donald, Catherine, and Tracy became the family they never knew they were missing. And in the end, love didn't just change their lives, it completed them. If this story touched your heart, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Ideal Stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting tale, because love, no matter how unexpectedly it begins, always finds its way.